Sometimes the places we run from are the only places that can save us. And sometimes what we leave behind refuses to let us go. In 1892, Amos Rigg abandoned his ranch after a violent feud. 30 years later, pushing 70 and worn by life, he returns expecting ruins. Instead, he finds the impossible. The land is alive. Animals roam the fields, the barn stands, and there, grey-muzzled and waiting, is Clover, his childhood donkey who survived 3 decades. But she wasn't alone. Outcasts have been living on his land, keeping it breathing. Now Amos must choose between reclaiming his past and protecting what it's become. But how did they survive, and what will he decide? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana dawn came cold and clear. The kind of morning that makes a man remember he's still alive, whether he wants to or not. Amos Rigg sat astride his roan gelding at the crest of the ridge, looking down into the valley where his past waited like an old wound that never quite healed. He was 69 years old, though he felt every one of those years in his bones. The grey in his beard had long since conquered the brown, and his face was a map of hard miles, lines etched deep by sun and wind, a scar that ran from his left eyebrow to his cheekbone, a reminder of a knife fight in Dodge City he barely remembered. His hands, wrapped around the reins, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who'd worked with rope and iron, and when necessary, steel. 30 years. 3 full decades since he'd ridden away from this place, swearing he'd never return. He'd been 39 then, still young enough to believe distance could cure what ailed a man's soul. He'd been wrong about that, like he'd been wrong about so many things. The ranch stretched out below him in the valley, nestled between 2 ridges of pine-covered hills. Even from this distance, he could see it wasn't the ruin he'd expected. The barn stood, dark wood weathered but solid. The house, his father's house, his house once, showed signs of habitation. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin grey line against the morning sky. That smoke stopped him cold. Someone was living in his house, on his land, in the place where his family had died and his life had ended. Even though his heart kept beating for 3 more decades, Amos reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a worn leather journal, its cover cracked and soft with age. He'd carried it for 30 years, but hadn't opened it in at least 20. The pages inside held fragments of the man he used to be, written in a younger hand that still believed in things like justice and redemption. He didn't open it now, just held it, feeling its weight. The roan shifted beneath him, sensing his hesitation. The horse was 10 years old, steady and patient, which was what Amos needed these days. The time for spirited mounts and hard rides had passed him by, though he could still sit a saddle from dawn to dusk if he had to. Memory came whether he wanted it or not, triggered by the landscape, by the smell of pine and morning frost, by the particular way the light fell across the valley. He was 12 years old again, racing his brother Jacob down this same ridge, their father's laughter echoing behind them. The world had been simple then, or seemed so. The ranch was their kingdom, and they were princes who would inherit it together. 30 years ago, he'd stood in that ranch house covered in his father's blood and his brother's, the smell of gunpowder thick in the air, and known that some things, once broken, could never be made whole again. He'd left that night, taken his horse, his gun, and the clothes on his back, left everything else behind. The land, the memories, the guilt that sat on his chest like a stone he couldn't lift. The years after were a blur of movement and dust. He'd signed on with cattle drives heading north from Texas, worked mines in Colorado, dealt cards in saloons from Deadwood to Tombstone. He'd been a deputy for a while in a town he couldn't quite remember the name of, a hired gun for a railroad company, a scout for the army during the last of the Apache troubles. He'd done things he wasn't proud of, and a few things that kept him awake at night, but nothing haunted him like the night he'd left this valley. He wasn't sure what had brought him back. Maybe it was the pneumonia that had nearly killed him in Denver 2 winters ago, the fever dreams where his father called his name over and over. Maybe it was the way his body was starting to fail him in small ways, the stiffness in his joints, come morning, the way his hands trembled sometimes for no reason, the occasional blank spaces in his memory that scared him more than any gunfight ever had. Or maybe he'd just run out of places to run to. A man pushing 70 couldn't keep moving forever. And there came a time when you had to turn and face what you'd been running from, or die with it chasing you. The journal in his hand contained the answer to why he'd run, written in his own hand 3 days after that terrible night. He'd written it in a fever of grief and guilt, trying to make sense of what had happened, trying to assign blame. He'd sealed it with wax and never read it again, afraid of what his younger self might have concluded. His father, William Rigg, had been a hard man but a fair one. He'd built the ranch from nothing, carved it out of wilderness and stubbornness. He'd taught his sons to ride, to shoot, to read and cipher, to treat hired men with respect and cheats with contempt. He'd taught them the value of a man's word and the price of broken trust. Jacob, 2 years younger than Amos, had been quick to laugh and quick to anger, charming and reckless in equal measure. They'd been close as boys, competed as young men, and by the time they were grown, something had curdled between them. Amos couldn't say exactly when it happened, but somewhere along the way, brotherhood had become rivalry. And rivalry had festered into something darker, the feud, because that's what it had become. Though it happened under one roof, had started over cattle. Some of their stock had gone missing, sold at market towns under false bills of sale. Their father had discovered the theft, and the evidence pointed to Jacob. When confronted, Jacob had accused Amos of framing him. Their father had demanded the truth from both of them. What happened next was confused in Amos's memory, blurred by emotion and 30 years of trying to forget. There had been shouting, accusations flying like fists. Their father had stepped between them. Guns had been drawn. His, Jacob's, he couldn't remember who pulled first. And then the sound, impossibly loud in the small ranch house, of a shot fired. Their father had fallen. More shots. Jacob going down. Blood spreading across the wooden floor, dark and terrible. Amos had dropped his gun and run, mounted the first horse he could find, and ridden into the night, not knowing if he'd killed his brother, his father, or both. He'd been too afraid to stay and find out, too afraid to face what he'd done. Coward, a voice in his head had whispered for 30 years. You ran like a coward. Now, sitting on this ridge with morning cold seeping through his coat, Amos studied the ranch below and tried to understand what he was seeing. The house looked maintained, not abandoned. The barn doors were closed properly. There were animals in the paddock. He could see their shapes moving, though he was too far away to make out details. The smoke from the chimney continued to rise, steady and purposeful. Someone had lit that fire with care, fed it with seasoned wood, tended it through the night and into the morning. His hands tightened on the reins. Part of him wanted to turn around, ride back to wherever the road might take him. Another part, the part that had brought him this far, wanted answers. Needed them, maybe, before whatever time he had left ran out. He touched his heels to the roan's flanks, and the horse started down the slope. The trail hadn't changed much. It still wound between the same rock formations, past the same stand of aspen that turned gold every autumn. His body remembered this ride, even if his mind had tried to forget. How many times had he ridden this path as a boy, as a young man? Hundreds, thousands maybe. As he descended, details became clearer. The house had been repaired, new shingles on the roof, fresh chinking between the logs. The fence around the vegetable garden was mended. Someone had cared for this place, invested labor and attention in keeping it alive. The thought filled him with a strange mixture of gratitude and resentment. Gratitude that his father's work hadn't simply rotted away. Resentment that strangers had taken what was his, even if he'd abandoned it. Closer now, he could see the animals more clearly. Horses in the paddock, good-looking stock. Chicken scratching in the yard. And there, near the barn, something that made him pull the roan to a complete stop, his breath catching in his throat. A donkey, grey-muzzled, swayback with age, but unmistakable. It couldn't be. It was impossible, but even from 50 yards away, even after 30 years, he knew, Clover, his childhood donkey, the patient creature that had carried him around this ranch when he was too small to ride a horse. She'd been ancient then, or so it had seemed to his child's eyes. She couldn't possibly have lived 3 decades more. Donkeys were hardy, but this defied reason. Yet there she stood, her head lifting as if she sensed his approach, ears swiveling toward him. Amos dismounted, his legs stiff from the long ride. He tied the roan to the fence rail and walked slowly toward the paddock, each step feeling like he was moving through deep water. The donkey watched him come, patient and still. When he reached the fence, he stopped. The donkey took 3 slow steps toward him, her movements careful with age. She pushed her muzzle over the fence rail toward his hand. Amos reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her soft nose. She smelled like hay and dust and memory. Her eyes, clouded with age, seemed to recognize him. She nuzzled his palm, and a sound escaped his throat. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "Clover," he whispered. "How did you—" "That's far enough, mister." The voice came from behind him, calm but firm. A woman's voice. Amos turned slowly, keeping his hands visible, and found himself facing a rifle held in steady hands. The woman was maybe 40, with brown hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that had seen their share of trouble. She wore a simple dress covered by a worn coat, and she held the rifle like she knew how to use it. Not threatening exactly, but not welcoming either. "This is private property," she said. "You'll need to state your business and move along." Amos studied her for a moment, then looked past her to the ranch house. 2 children, a boy about 10 and a girl maybe 7, peered from the window, their faces pressed against the glass. An older man, black and grey-bearded, stood in the barn doorway holding a pitchfork like it might need to be more than a farming tool. Another man, younger and lean, emerged from around the house with a revolver at his hip, his hand not quite touching it but ready to. "My name is Amos Rigg," he said quietly. "This ranch belonged to my father. To my family." The woman's expression flickered. Surprise, concern, something else he couldn't quite read. The rifle didn't lower. "Rigg." She said it like she was tasting the word, deciding what it meant. "We heard that name. Heard this place belonged to the Riggs once, a long time ago." 30 years, Amos said. "I've been gone 30 years. That's a powerful long time to be away from something you owned." The woman's voice was careful now, measuring each word. "Long enough that folks might think it was abandoned for good." "I expect they might." Amos kept his hands visible, aware of the younger man with the revolver, watching his every movement. "I didn't come to cause trouble, ma'am. I came to see what was left. And now you've seen it." She paused, then seemed to come to a decision. "I'm Sarah Hendricks. These people you see, we've been living here 5 years. We've tended this place, fixed what was broken, kept it alive. We didn't know anyone was coming back. I didn't know I was coming back either," Amos admitted. "Not until I did." Sarah lowered the rifle slightly, though she didn't set it aside. "You want us to leave?" It wasn't a question, and Amos found he didn't have a quick answer. He looked around the ranch, at the repaired buildings, the tended garden, the healthy animals. At Clover, impossibly alive, impossibly waiting. At the smoke still rising from the chimney of his father's house. "I don't know what I want," he said. And it was the most honest thing he'd said in years. The old man from the barn approached slowly. The pitchfork lowered now, but still in hand. Up close, Amos could see he was probably in his 70s, his face weathered and wise, his eyes sharp despite his age. "Name's Isaiah Booker," the man said, his voice deep and measured. "I've been here 4 years. Before that, I worked camps and fields after the war. Thought I'd find a place to rest my bones before the Lord called me home." The younger man came closer as well, moving with a slight limp that suggested an old injury. He was maybe 30, with sandy hair and cautious eyes. "Thomas Garrett. I was a deputy once, before things went wrong. Been here 3 years." Amos nodded to each of them, then returned his attention to Sarah. "Your husband?" "Dead," she said flatly. "Killed by bandits on the road from Kansas City. That was 5 years ago. My children and I had nowhere to go. We found this place and it was empty. We've made it home." There was no apology in her voice, no pleading. Just facts, laid out like cards on a table. Amos respected that, the donkey, he said, nodding toward Clover. She was mine when I was a boy. She would have been old even then. I can't understand how she's still alive. Isaiah chuckled softly. That creature's got more stubbornness than sense. Was already here when I arrived. Half wild, living in the barn, surviving on grass and whatever else she could find. I gentled her some, got her healthy again. Animals like that. Sometimes they just decide they're not done yet. Amos walked back to the fence and ran his hand along Clover's neck. She leaned into his touch, and he felt something crack inside his chest, not breaking but opening. A door he'd kept locked for 3 decades, showing a sliver of light behind it. I need to think, he said finally. I need time. We can be gone by tomorrow, Sarah said quietly. We don't have much. Won't take long to pack. Amos turned to look at her, really look at her. She was tired, he could see that. Tired in the way that comes from carrying too much weight for too long. Her children were watching from the window, and he could see the worry in their small faces, even from here. They'd found safety here, something rare in a hard world, and he was about to take it away. I didn't say you had to leave tomorrow. He rubbed his beard, feeling every day of his 69 years. I said I needed to think. I'll sleep in the barn tonight. We can talk more in the morning. Thomas spoke for the first time since introducing himself. You've got a legal right to the land. We're squatters, plain and simple. Law would side with you. Maybe, Amos said. But the law and what's right aren't always the same thing. I learned that a long time ago. He unsaddled his roan and led the horse into the paddock with the others. Clover followed him like she had when he was 12 years old, her hooves shuffling through the dust. In the barn, he found his old tack room, now clearly used for storage, and was surprised to see some of his belongings still there. His father's tools hung neatly on the wall. An old saddle, he remembered, though the leather was cracked now with age. A wooden box he'd kept treasures in as a child. He opened the box with trembling hands. Inside were small things, a rock from the creek bed that had seemed special once, a broken watch, a carved horse his father had made him, and beneath these, wrapped in oiled cloth, a weathered halter with his initials carved into the leather, Clover's halter. The one he'd made himself when he was 14, practicing leatherwork under his father's patient instruction. He'd been so proud of it then. He held it up to the light filtering through the barn boards. Someone had cared for it, kept it oiled and supple. Someone had preserved this piece of his childhood, along with everything else. That night, as darkness settled over the valley, Amos made a small camp in the barn. He could have asked to sleep in the house, his house, legally speaking, but he couldn't bring himself to cross that threshold. Not yet. The house held ghosts he wasn't ready to face. Through the barn boards, he could see the windows of the ranch house glowing with lamplight. He could hear voices faint and indistinct, the murmur of a family settling in for the evening. Sarah reading to her children, maybe. Isaiah and Thomas talking quietly over coffee. The life he'd run from had died 30 years ago. But somehow, impossibly, life had found this place again. Not his life, but life nonetheless. The ranch breathed with it. The land thrived under their care. Even Clover had held on, waiting for something. Amos lay on his bedroll, staring up at the barn rafters, and thought about the choices that had led him here. The violence, the guilt, the running. 30 years of wandering because he couldn't forgive himself for one terrible night. 30 years of living like a ghost, present in the world, but never quite part of it. And now he'd returned to find strangers had made his home their sanctuary. He could claim his legal right. Send them away. Live here alone with his memories and his guilt until his body gave out. It would be his right, or he could do something else. Something he couldn't quite name yet, but could feel taking shape in his mind. As fragile and new as morning light, through the barn wall. Clover shuffled in her stall, making the small sounds of a creature at peace. Amos closed his eyes and listened to her breathing, to the night sounds of the ranch, to the ghosts that waited in the darkness between what he'd been and what he might still become. Tomorrow he would decide. Tonight, for the first time in 30 years, he was home. Morning came with the sound of roosters and the smell of coffee drifting from the house. Amos woke stiff and cold, his body reminding him that sleeping on barn floors was a young man's game. He rolled up his bedroll and stepped outside to find the ranch already alive with activity. Sarah was at the chicken coop, gathering eggs in a wicker basket. Her daughter, he remembered her peering from the window, helped by scattering feed while talking to the chickens in a soft, serious voice. The girl wore a patched dress and had her mother's brown hair in braids. She stopped when she saw Amos, uncertainty crossing her face. "Morning," Amos said, keeping his voice gentle. The girl looked to her mother for guidance. Sarah straightened, setting down the egg basket, her expression guarded but not hostile. "Morning, Mr. Rigg. Coffee's on if you want it. We don't have much for breakfast, but you're welcome to share." It was a careful offer, neither too friendly nor dismissive. Amos nodded his thanks and walked toward the house, each step heavy with the weight of crossing a threshold he'd run from for 3 decades. The door opened before he reached it. Isaiah stood there, 2 cups of coffee in his hands, steam rising in the cool morning air. He handed one to Amos without a word and gestured to the porch chairs, the same chairs Amos's father had made, now worn smooth by years and weather. "Figured you might want a moment before going inside," Isaiah said. Settling into one chair while Amos took the other, they sat in silence for a while, drinking coffee and watching the day come to life. The valley was caught in that particular morning light that makes everything seem possible. Amos had forgotten how beautiful this place was, or maybe he'd never let himself admit it. "You work the animals well," Amos said finally. "Spent my whole life working with creatures," Isaiah replied. "Horses, cattle, mules. After the war, I worked stables in St. Louis for a time. Then I got old, and old black men aren't much wanted in cities. Found my way here by accident. Or providence, depending on how you see things. You could have kept moving. Could have." Isaiah took a slow sip of coffee. "But I was tired, Mr. Rigg. Tired of moving, tired of looking over my shoulder, tired of not having a place to call my own. This land, it has a way of holding on to folks who need holding." Amos understood that more than he wanted to admit. He looked out at Clover in the paddock, her grey form solid and real in the morning light. "The donkey. You said she was half wild when you got here, wild and wary. Took me 3 months to get a hand on her. But she remembered kindness once she felt it again. Animals don't forget, not really. They remember who they were and who they could be." The words sat between them, and Amos wondered if Isaiah was still talking about the donkey. Inside the house, he could hear movement, Thomas helping Sarah's son with something, their voices low. The domestic sounds of a life being lived. It should have felt wrong, these strangers in his father's house. Instead, it felt like the place was breathing. Again, after holding its breath for 30 years, after breakfast, simple biscuits and eggs that tasted better than any. A meal he'd had in years. Amos asked if he could look around the property. Sarah agreed, though he could see the tension in her shoulders. She was waiting for him to make his decision, to tell them to pack and leave. He spent the morning walking every corner of the ranch. Thomas followed at a distance, respectful but watchful. The man's limp was more pronounced in the morning, and Amos noticed how he favored his right side. "Where'd you get the wound?" Amos asked when they stopped by the creek. Thomas looked surprised at the direct question. "Bullet. Deputy job went bad. Sheriff I worked for was taking bribes from a gang. When I found out and said I'd report it, his men came for me. Got away, but barely. Hard thing learning men you trust are corrupt. Harder thing is living with what you did about it." Thomas picked up a stone and skipped it across the creek water. "I ran instead of fighting. Left the town to the wolves. Sometimes I wonder if that makes me as guilty as they were." Amos thought about running, about 30 years of distance that had solved nothing. "Running and guilt are old companions," he said. "I know that better than most." They walked back toward the barn in comfortable silence. Inside, Amos found himself drawn to the tack room again, to the box of his childhood belongings. He went through it more carefully this time, touching each item, remembering the boy who treasured them, beneath the wooden horse and the broken watch. He found something that made him go still, a pistol, Colt .45, cleaned and oiled, in perfect working order. He picked it up with hands that wanted to shake, felt its weight, checked the chamber. unloaded but maintained with care, his brother's gun. He'd know it anywhere, the scratched initials on the grip, the worn bluing on the barrel. Jacob had carried this the night everything fell apart. The night their father fell and the world caught fire. Found that in the house, Thomas said quietly from the doorway. Wrapped in cloth, hidden in a false bottom of a dresser drawer. Figured it was family. Left it be but kept it clean. Seemed like the respectful thing. Amos turned the pistol over in his hands, and memory crashed over him like a wave. The shouting, his father's face twisted with anger and disappointment. Jacob's accusations, his own defensive rage. The metallic smell of fear and fury in that small room. Their father stepping between them, hands raised. "Put the guns down, both of you. We're family, damn it." And then the shot, so loud it seemed to stop time itself. His father falling, Jacob's face shocked and pale. Another shot, then another. Blood spreading across the wooden floor, dark and terrible in the lamplight. Amos had to sit down, his legs suddenly weak. He placed the pistol on the workbench and put his head in his hands. "You all right?" Thomas asked. "No," Amos said honestly. "But I haven't been all right for 30 years. This is just me remembering why." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "Sarah told me what she'd heard about this place. About what happened here. Said there was a shooting. That the Rigg family killed each other in a feud. Said the youngest son ran and never came back. That's the story." Amos looked up at the younger man. "You afraid of me now? Knowing I killed my own kin?" "I'm a man who ran from his duty and let good people suffer for it," Thomas said. "I'm not in a position to judge anyone." Through the barn door, Amos could see Sarah teaching her children to read from an old Bible, the three of them sitting on the porch in the afternoon sun. The boy struggled over the words while his sister watched, patient and encouraging. Isaiah was mending a fence line, his movements slow but sure. The chickens scratched in the yard. Glover dozed in a patch of sunlight. Peace. That's what they'd brought to this place. Not just maintenance and survival, but actual peace. The land had been bleeding when he left it, soaked in violence and grief. They'd bandaged it with their presence, their labor, their simple human need for a place to heal. "I've spent 30 years trying to outrun what happened in this house," Amos said. "Thought distance would make the guilt lighter. It didn't. It just spread it out over more ground. Guilt's a prison without walls," Thomas observed. "You can walk forever and still be locked inside it." Amos picked up the pistol again, felt its weight. His brother had held this same gun, probably in fear and anger, probably not meaning to kill anyone, but caught in a moment that spiraled out of control. They'd both been young men playing at being hard, neither one wise enough to step back before it was too late. He thought about what Isaiah had said about animals remembering kindness, about how Clover had been wild but came back to herself when she felt safety again, about how this land, wounded and abandoned, had come alive again when people cared for it. "They've given this place something I never could," Amos said quietly. "They've given it peace, made it a home instead of a graveyard. So you're letting us stay?" Thomas asked, hope and caution mixing in his voice. "I'm thinking about it." Amos set the pistol down gently. "I'm thinking about whether a man who ran from his past has any right to disrupt other people who are running from theirs." That evening, they all ate together. An awkward, careful meal where everyone was too polite and the silences stretched long. But Sarah's children asked him questions about the ranch when it was new, and Amos found himself telling stories he'd thought forgotten, about his father teaching him to rope, about the winter the wolves came close and they had to guard the stock all night, about the first calf he'd delivered on his own. Sure, he was doing it wrong until his father's steady voice talked him through it. The children listened with wide eyes, and for the first time in 30 years, those memories didn't cut like knives. They were just stories, pieces of a life that had been good before it turned bad. After dinner, Isaiah found him in the barn. "You're wrestling with something heavy," the old man observed. "Trying to figure out what's right," Amos admitted. "Legal right says this is my land. Moral right might say something different. What does your heart say?" Amos looked at Clover's stall, where the old donkey rested peacefully. "My heart's been too broken to trust for a long time." He paused. "But maybe that's changing. A week passed in a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. Amos stayed in the barn, but each day found him more integrated into the life of the ranch. He helped Isaiah with the morning feeding, showed Thomas how to properly doctor a horse's split hoof, and spent an afternoon helping Sarah repair the chicken coop where the wire had rusted through. They were careful around each other, these refugees in the place he'd once called home. But the carefulness was eroding, worn down by shared work and the simple reality of living in close quarters. By the fourth day, Sarah no longer tensed when he approached. By the sixth, her son, Billy, he'd learned, asked Amos to help him with his arithmetic, and Amos found himself explaining long division while the boy scratched figures on a slate. The girl, whose name was Emma, was more reserved. She watched Amos from a distance, curious but cautious, like a bird deciding if the offered seed is safe to take. He didn't push. He'd learned patience over the years, if nothing else. On the 8th morning, he woke to find Emma sitting cross-legged outside his tack room, holding something small in her hands. When she saw him stir, she scrambled to her feet, looking guilty. "I'm sorry, Mr. Rigg. Mama says I shouldn't bother you. She held out what she'd been examining. "I found this in the barn. It's beautiful. Did you make it?" It was the wooden horse his father had carved, the one from the box of childhood treasures. The wood was dark with age, but still smooth, the details still clear, the flowing mane, the powerful legs, the noble head. His father had spent weeks on it, working by lamplight after long days of ranch work, getting every detail right. Amos took it gently from her small hands. "My father made it. For me, when I was about your brother's age. It must have been special," Emma said softly. "To keep it all this time." It was. Amos sat down on an overturned bucket, and after a moment's hesitation, Emma sat on the barn floor near him. "My father wasn't much for words, but he knew how to make things. He believed a man should work with his hands, create something lasting, like the ranch." "Like the ranch," Amos agreed. He turned the horse over in his hands, remembering. "He used to tell me and my brother that this land was more than dirt and grass. He said it was responsibility, that what you build, you have to tend. What you start, you have to finish." He paused, the old guilt rising. "I didn't finish what I started here." Emma studied him with those serious child's eyes that seemed to see more than they should. "Mama says sometimes we have to leave places. She says it doesn't mean we didn't love them. Your mama's a wise woman. She cries sometimes at night, when she thinks we can't hear." Emma picked at a splinter on the barn floor. "I think she's scared you'll make us leave." The simple honesty of it hit Amos square in the chest. He looked at this child who'd found shelter in the place he'd abandoned, who'd made a home in his grief and guilt, and he felt something shift inside him. Not quite healing, but maybe the beginning of it. "I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet," he said carefully. "But I promise you this. Whatever I decide, I'll make sure you and your family have somewhere to go. I won't leave you with nothing." Emma nodded, accepting this. Then she surprised him by saying, "Will you teach me to carve? Like your father taught you?" Amos looked at the wooden horse, at the little girl watching him with hope in her eyes, and made a decision he hadn't known he was going to make. "Yes, I'll teach you," they started that afternoon. Amos found his father's old carving tools, still sharp under a thin film of rust. He cleaned them carefully while Emma watched, explaining each one's purpose. Then he cut 2 pieces of soft pine and showed her how to hold the knife, how to let the wood tell you where it wanted to go. Her small hands were clumsy at first, and he had to guide them often, but she was patient and careful. Billy joined them after a while, intrigued by what his sister was doing. Soon both children were working on small projects while Amos supervised, offering quiet corrections and encouragement. Sarah found them there as the sun was setting, her children covered in wood shavings and concentrating fiercely on their work. She stood in the barn doorway, and when Amos looked up, he saw tears in her eyes. "My father used to do this with me," she said quietly. "Before he died?" I'd forgotten what it looked like, children learning something with patient hands. That night, for the first time, Amos accepted Sarah's invitation to eat dinner in the house. He hesitated at the door, that old resistance rising, but Billy grabbed his hand and pulled him inside with the casual trust of childhood. The interior was cleaner than he remembered, better organized. Sarah had added touches that made it a home. Curtains on the windows, a checkered cloth on the table, wildflowers in a jar. But the bones of the house were the same. The fireplace where his father used to sit and smoke his pipe. The corner where his mother's rocking chair had been, before she died of fever when he was 16. The spot on the floor where he forced the memory away and sat at the table. The conversation was easier now, less guarded. Thomas told a story about a time he'd arrested a man for stealing chickens, only to discover the man's children were starving. Isaiah shared memories of the war, of hardship and brotherhood, and learning what freedom truly meant. Sarah talked about her husband, about the good years before the violence took him. Amos found himself talking too, sharing pieces of his wandering years. The cattle drives, the mining camps, the time he'd served as a guide for a survey party mapping railroad routes. He edited the violence out, the times his gun had settled disputes, but the stories were his, and telling them felt like pulling splinters from old wounds. After dinner, Billy asked if Amos knew any songs. Before he could answer, Emma ran to fetch a harmonica from somewhere, and it turned out Thomas could play. The sound filled the house, simple melodies, old songs everyone knew. Isaiah's deep voice carried the verses while Sarah hummed harmony, and the children clapped along. Amos didn't sing, but he listened, and for the first time since returning, the house felt like something other than a monument to the dead. Later, walking back to the barn, he paused to look at the stars. The same stars he'd looked at as a boy, learning the constellations from his father. Orion's belt, the Big Dipper, Cassiopeia like a tilted W across the northern sky. You're staying, aren't you? Isaiah's voice came from the darkness. The old man was smoking a pipe on the porch, the tobacco smoke sweet in the night air. I don't know yet, Amos said, but it was less true than it had been. Man can spend his whole life running from one night, Isaiah observed, or he can stand still and let that night become just one night among thousands. Your choice, which kind of man you want to be. In the paddock, Clover made a soft sound as if agreeing. Amos touched the wooden horse in his pocket. Emma had insisted he keep it for now, said he'd earned it back. Such a small thing, carved by a father's hands for a son who hadn't deserved it, who had run from it and everything it represented. But maybe, just maybe, deserving wasn't the point. The next morning, Thomas took the wagon to town for supplies. Amos offered to go along, and they rode together through the autumn countryside. The trees were starting to turn, gold and red against the dark green of the pines. Town's changed some, Thomas warned as they approached. More people, more buildings. The sheriff's a man named Wade Corrigan. He has opinions about things, what Thomas didn't say. But Amos understood was that Corrigan would have opinions about Amos Rigg returning after 30 years. They weren't 3 steps into the general store when Amos felt the room go quiet. The proprietor, a man Amos didn't recognize, looked up from his ledger and his face went carefully blank. 2 customers by the barrel of pickles whispered to each other, staring. Heard you were back, the proprietor said slowly. Amos Rigg, after all these years? I am. Heard you found squatters on your land. I found people living on the ranch, yes. Heard one of them is selling eggs and vegetables in town, using the Rigg name like they had a right to it. The man's voice was flat, neither friendly nor hostile, just stating facts. Thomas stepped forward. Mrs. Hendricks has been selling her goods honestly, never claimed ownership of anything. Still, the proprietor said, folks are wondering what's to be done about it. The Rigg place has been empty a long time. Some might say abandoned. Amos understood what wasn't being said. The town had moved on, built itself around his absence. His return disrupted the settled order of things, raised questions about property and rights and the past, reaching forward to complicate the present. I'm still deciding what's to be done, Amos said carefully. But until I decide, those people are my guests. Anyone has a problem with that, they can take it up with me. It was a line drawn, a claim made. The proprietor nodded slowly, making note of it. The whispers would start before they left the store, Amos knew. By sundown, the whole town would know that Amos Rigg had returned and thrown his protection over the squatters on his land. What that would mean, he couldn't say. But he'd made his choice, at least for now. And choices, his father used to say, were what defined a man. They loaded supplies and headed back to the ranch, the wagon wheels creaking in the silence. Thomas didn't ask what Amos had decided, and Amos didn't volunteer it. But something had shifted. Some internal balance had tipped, and they both knew it. The past was still there, still waiting in the shadows of that house. But maybe the present had a claim too. Maybe the future was more than just death and dissolution. Maybe, just maybe, there was still time for grace. The trouble came 3 days later, dressed in a good suit and riding a fine bay horse. Wade Corrigan was a man in his 50s, prosperous-looking, with silver streaking his dark hair and eyes that assessed everything like a banker counting coins. He rode up to the ranch with 2 men flanking him, both wearing deputy badges that glinted in the afternoon sun. Amos was working with Isaiah to replace a section of fencing when he saw them coming. Something in his gut tightened, that old instinct that had kept him alive through dangerous years. He set down his tools and walked toward the house, where Sarah had emerged onto the porch with her rifle, not raised, but present. "Mrs. Hendricks," Corrigan called out pleasantly, touching his hat. "And you must be Amos Rigg, heard you come back. I'm Wade Corrigan, own the bank in town. Also serve as sheriff, keeping the peace. Mr. Corrigan." Amos positioned himself between the rider and the house. A small shift that wasn't lost on anyone. Corrigan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'll get right to it. I hold the deed to this property. Have for near about 15 years now. Your father mortgaged it back in 77, couldn't make payments, and the bank foreclosed after he died." The words hit Amos like a physical blow. "My father wouldn't have mortgaged this land. He built it from nothing, owned it free and clear. Times got hard for everyone in the late 70s, Corrigan said reasonably. Drought, cattle prices dropped, men did what they had to do. Your father took a loan using the land as collateral. When he passed and no family came forward to settle the debt, the bank took possession, as the law allows. If you own it, why aren't you living here?" Thomas had appeared from the barn, his hand resting casually on his revolver. "Why let others work the place?" "I've been lenient," Corrigan replied, still pleasant. "Mrs. Hendricks and her friends have been squatting, but I allowed it out of Christian charity. Figured an empty place was better used than sitting vacant. But now that Mr. Rigg has returned, circumstances have changed." "Changed how?" Amos asked. Corrigan's smile widened slightly. "Well, I'm a practical man. I don't need this ranch, got plenty of holdings. But I could use a man of your reputation, Rigg. Heard stories about you. Fast gun, steady hand, not afraid of hard work or hard men." He paused meaningfully. "You work for me, keep order in my interests, and I'll deed this property back to you." "Simple arrangement. What kind of order?" Thomas asked sharply. "The legal kind. Collecting debts, discouraging trouble, making sure people understand how things work around here." Corrigan's pleasant tone didn't change, but the words carried weight. "Montana's changing, getting civilized. That takes men who know how to be persuasive." Amos understood perfectly what was being offered. He'd seen men like Corrigan before, in every frontier town that was transitioning from rough camp to settled community. Men who used the law as a tool for accumulation, who hired guns to enforce their version of order. He'd worked for men like that once or twice in his younger days before he learned what it cost his soul. "I'll think on it," Amos said carefully. "Don't think too long." "I'm not a patient man." Corrigan gathered his reins. "And Mrs. Hendricks, I'm afraid I can't accept your goods at the stores in town anymore. Liability issue, you understand. Can't have squatters representing my property in commerce." Sarah's face went pale, but she held her ground. Those eggs and vegetables were how they'd been surviving, their small income from the work of their hands. Corrigan was squeezing them, applying pressure. "You have until the end of the week to decide, Rigg," Corrigan said. "After that, I'll exercise my legal rights to clear squatters from my property." "Sheriff's rights, you understand." He touched his hat again. "Good day to you all." They watched him ride away, the dust of his horse's passage hanging in the air like a threat. "He's lying," Thomas said immediately. About the foreclosure. Has to be. Maybe, Amos said, but maybe not. I don't know what my father did after I left. 15 years is a long time. That evening, Sarah was cleaning in the house, something she did when she was worried, keeping her hands busy. Amos had come inside to look through the old desk, where his father had kept papers, searching for anything that might dispute Corrigan's claim. In the back of a drawer, Sarah found a small wooden frame covered in dust. She wiped it clean and gasped softly, "Mr. Rigg, you should see this." It was a daguerreotype, faded but clear. 4 people stood in front of the ranch house, younger versions of that building, newer wood and fresh paint. His father stern and solid, his mother dead 20 years now, beautiful in her simple dress. And 2 boys, maybe 15 and 13, standing side by side, Amos and Jacob, brothers before everything fell apart. Amos took the frame with shaking hands. He'd forgotten this image existed, forgotten that there had been a time when they smiled together, when the word family meant safety instead of tragedy. "That's your brother?" Sarah asked gently. "Yes." The word came out rough. "Jacob, we were close once." Sarah sat down at the table, waiting. Emma and Billy were outside with Isaiah, and Thomas was checking the stock. The house was quiet, just the 2 of them, and the ghosts in the photograph. "I heard in town," Sarah said carefully, "that your father and brother died the same night, that there was a feud, violence. No one knew the whole story, but the talk was, that I killed them," Amos finished. "That's what people think, isn't it? That I murdered my family and ran." Sarah met his eyes. "I'm not asking you to tell me. I want to understand. If we're fighting to keep this place, I need to know what we're fighting for. Who you are." Amos looked at the daguerreotype, at the boys they'd been, innocent of what was coming. He'd carried this story alone for 30 years, never speaking it aloud, never letting anyone see the full truth of it. But something about Sarah's steady gaze, about the way this woman and her makeshift family had given life to his dead place, made him want to try. "There were cattle going missing," he began, his voice low. "Someone was rustling them, selling them under false papers. My father discovered it, and the evidence pointed to Jacob. When confronted, Jacob said I was the one, that I was trying to frame him, to take the whole ranch for myself." He paused, the memory vivid and painful. "The truth was, neither of us was stealing. We found out later it was one of the hired hands, a man we both trusted. But that night in that room, we didn't know that. We just knew our father was accusing us, and we were accusing each other, and everything we'd ever resented about each other came pouring out." "Your father tried to stop it," Sarah said quietly. "He stepped between us. We both had our guns drawn. I don't even remember pulling mine, but there it was in my hand. And then—" Amos closed his eyes. "There was a shot. So loud. My father fell. I saw blood, and I saw Jacob's gun smoking, and I fired. Jacob went down, and then I ran." The confession hung in the air between them. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, her face thoughtful. "You don't know if you killed him," she said finally. "Your brother?" "No. I assumed I did. The guilt assumed I did. But I never stayed to find out. I just ran. And you've carried that uncertainty for 30 years. Amos nodded, unable to speak. Sarah reached across the table and placed her hand over his weathered skin to weathered skin, survivor to survivor. "I killed the man who murdered my husband," she said, her voice steady. "He and his partners ambushed us on the road, got my husband first. But I had a rifle, and I knew how to use it. Got 2 of them before they ran. One of those men died." Amos looked at her in surprise. She met his gaze without flinching. "I don't regret it," she continued, "but I understand guilt. I understand violence and its cost. And I understand that sometimes we do terrible things in terrible moments, and we have to live with them." "Dee," she squeezed his hand. "But we don't have to let those moments define every moment that comes after. Corrigan wants me to be violent for him," Amos said. "Wants to use what I am, what I was, to hurt people. It's what I deserve, maybe. Payment for what I've done." "You deserve what we all deserve," Sarah said firmly. A chance to be better than our worst day. A chance to build something instead of destroying it. Emma's voice called from outside, excited about something. Sarah stood, squeezing Amos's shoulder as she passed. Think about that. Think about what your father built here and what we've tried to keep alive. That's what we're fighting for. Not the past, but the possibility of the future. Alone in the house, Amos looked at the daguerreotype again. 4. People who loved each other before fear and pride and misunderstanding tore them apart. He thought about Corrigan's offer, about becoming an enforcer for a corrupt man, about using violence as currency again after all these years trying to escape it. Then he thought about Emma, learning to carve wood, about Billy, struggling with arithmetic, about Clover waiting 3 decades for someone to come home, about Isaiah finding peace in his old age, and Thomas trying to rebuild his sense of honor, and Sarah teaching her children to read from an old Bible while rebuilding a life from ashes. The past had its claims, but maybe the present had rights too. He placed the daguerreotype on the mantel, where his father might have kept it, where it could remind him every day of what was lost, and what might still be saved. Outside, the sun was setting over the valley, painting everything gold. Through the window, he could see his small community at their evening tasks, these broken people he'd found sheltering in his broken place. I'm not working for you, Corrigan, he said to the empty room, but I'm not leaving either. It was a declaration, a line drawn, and lines, once drawn, had to be defended. Thomas had been a deputy long enough to understand how fraud worked. The next morning, he spread papers across the kitchen table, everything they could find in the old desk, every scrap that might have a date or signature. Isaiah helped sort them while Sarah kept the children occupied outside, teaching them to identify plants in the garden. Your father was meticulous, Thomas observed, examining a ledger from 1876. Every expense recorded, every sale documented. This doesn't read like a man who couldn't pay his debts. Amos stood at the window, watching Emma and Billy pull weeds under their mother's guidance. Unless something happened after I left that I didn't know about. Possibly. Thomas pulled out another document, squinting at the faded ink. But look at this. Receipt for payment on a mortgage, dated January 1878, just 2 months before your father died. Corrigan said the foreclosure was in 77. Exactly. Thomas set the receipt down carefully. If there was a mortgage and it was being paid, then the timeline doesn't match. Unless Isaiah, who had been quietly examining the desk itself, made a sound. Found something. The old man had discovered a false bottom in one of the drawers, the kind that looked solid until you pressed the right spot. Inside was a torn piece of paper, yellowed and brittle. Thomas handled it carefully, bringing it into better light. It's part of a deed, he breathed. Original land deed by the look of it. See here, it's been torn, but you can make out your father's signature and the date. 1867, when he filed the claim. Why would he tear his own deed? Amos asked. He wouldn't, Thomas said grimly. But someone else might if they wanted to make it look like no clear title existed. Makes fraudulent foreclosure easier to claim. They all looked at each other, understanding settling in. If Corrigan had forged foreclosure documents, he'd have wanted to destroy or hide evidence of legitimate ownership. A torn deed, a manufactured mortgage, carefully timed to happen when no family member was around to contest it. We need the county records, Thomas said. The original filings, mortgage documents, foreclosure papers, everything Corrigan filed to claim this land. County office is in town, Amos said, controlled by Corrigan's people. I know the clerk, Isaiah said quietly. Man named Henderson. Good man, but scared. Corrigan squeezed him like he squeezes everyone. But Henderson knew your father, Amos. Respected him. Might be willing to help if we asked right. Dangerous to ask, Thomas warned. If Corrigan finds out we're investigating, he'll move faster. Then we don't ask, Amos said. We take. They planned for 2 days, working out the details while maintaining their usual routines. To outside eyes, nothing had changed. Sarah sold her last eggs to a sympathetic neighbor on the edge of town. Amos and Isaiah repaired the barn roof. Thomas practiced his shooting at empty bottles, the sound carrying across the valley like a reminder that not everyone here was defenseless. At night, they studied the town layout. Thomas drew maps from memory, showing where the county office stood, which roads offered escape routes, where Corrigan's men usually posted themselves. "It's a burglary," Sarah pointed out, her voice careful. "If you're caught, Corrigan will have you arrested. Legal right on his side, regardless of what documents he's forged." "I've done worse things," Amos said quietly, "and for worse reasons." The night they chose was moonless, the sky covered with clouds that promised rain. Amos and Thomas rode together, leaving Isaiah to watch over Sarah and the children. The old man had wanted to come, but his age made stealth difficult, and they all knew it. The town was quiet when they arrived just after midnight. A few lamps burned in windows, but the streets were empty. The county office was a small building near the bank, conveniently close to Corrigan's main enterprise. Thomas had the tools to pick the lock, learned from his deputy days when citizens locked themselves out of their own properties. The door opened with a soft click. Inside, filing cabinets lined the walls, organized by year and type. They worked by shielded lamplight, careful to keep the glow from the windows. Thomas knew the system, found the property records for the ranch quickly. "Here," he whispered, pulling out a folder. Inside were mortgage papers, foreclosure notices, transfer of title documents, all signed and notarized, all looking legitimate. But Thomas's trained eye caught the discrepancies, dates that didn't quite line up, signatures that varied slightly from other known examples, paper stock that seemed newer than it should be for documents supposedly filed 15 years ago. "He forged most of this," Thomas said. "Not all at once, but over time, building a paper trail that would hold up to casual inspection. Is there anything about my father's death? Any official record?" Thomas dug deeper, found another folder. "Here, death certificate signed by the doctor. Cause of death listed as gunshot wound, accidental. Report filed by—" He paused, reading. "Report filed by Wade Corrigan, acting in his capacity as concerned citizen since no family was present." "Accidental," Amos repeated, the words strange in his mouth. "Not murder. Not—" "The doctor who signed this is dead now," Thomas said. "But if he wrote accidental, there must have been reason. Maybe the wound wasn't— A sound outside froze them both. Footsteps on the boardwalk, moving slow and deliberate. Thomas doused the lamp instantly, plunging them into darkness. They pressed against the wall, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped at the door. A rattle of the handle, then silence. Amos's hand moved to his gun, though drawing it would mean admitting what they were doing here. After an eternity, the footsteps moved on. They waited 5 full minutes before Thomas risked relighting the lamp. "We need to take these," Thomas whispered. "All of them. Every fraudulent document, every discrepancy. He'll know they're missing. That's why we need to move fast once we have them." Thomas carefully extracted the papers, replacing them with blank sheets of similar size, a trick to delay discovery. "We take these to a territorial judge, present them as evidence of fraud, and hope the judge isn't in Corrigan's pocket," Amos finished. Thomas's expression was grim. "It's the only legal option we have." They were almost to the door when Thomas stopped. "Wait, there's one more file I should check." He went back to the cabinet, searching. When he found what he was looking for, his face went pale in the lamplight. "What is it?" Thomas handed him a document. It was a letter, sealed originally but now opened, addressed to the county clerk. The handwriting was careful and formal, the signature at the bottom unmistakable, William Rigg, Amos's father. The letter was dated March 1878, written 3 weeks before his death. Amos read it by the dim lamplight, his heart hammering. The letter explained that there had been a misunderstanding about the ranch, about cattle theft and accusations between his sons. It stated that the true thief had been found and dealt with. It asked that if anything should happen to him, the ranch was to be held in trust, not sold, not transferred, but maintained as a place of refuge for those who needed it. "A sanctuary," Amos whispered. "He wanted it to be a sanctuary. There was more." The letter forgave both sons for the violence and anger, acknowledged his own failures in handling the situation. It was a father's last words to children who would never read them, filed away in a government office and forgotten. "This changes everything," Thomas said. "If the ranch was supposed to be held in trust, then Corrigan's claim is completely invalid. Your father never wanted ownership to matter. He wanted the land to serve a purpose." Amos read the letter again, his father's words reaching across death and decades. All those years, he'd believed himself a murderer, believed his brother hated him, believed the violence had destroyed everything. And his father had forgiven them both, had tried to turn tragedy into something meaningful. "Take it," Amos said hoarsely. "Take everything. We're finishing this." They gathered all the documents and slipped out into the night. The rain had started, cold and steady, covering their escape. They rode hard back to the ranch, the papers wrapped and protected inside Thomas's coat. But as they approached the property, they saw lights, too many lights. Torches burning in the darkness and the shapes of riders surrounding the ranch house. Corrigan hadn't waited. He'd moved while they were gone, knowing or guessing what they'd try. Amos and Thomas reined in at the ridge, looking down at their home under siege. They could see Sarah and the children huddled on the porch, Isaiah standing guard with his old rifle. If a dozen of Corrigan's men formed a loose cordon, not threatening yet, but present and armed, "We could run," Thomas said. "Take the documents to the territorial capital, find an honest judge, and leave them?" Amos looked at the people below. His people now, whether he'd meant for them to be or not. The family he'd found in the ruins of the one he'd destroyed. Thomas checked his revolver, rain dripping from his hat brim. "Then we go down there. And say what? We just stole county documents. Corrigan has the legal high ground." "Maybe," Thomas smiled grimly. "But we have the truth. Sometimes that's worth more than the law." They rode down the slope as the rain grew heavier, washing the dust from the air, heading toward whatever came next. The documents that might save them were wrapped against Thomas's chest, fragile paper holding the weight of history and hope. Behind them, the valley spread dark and vast. Ahead, the ranch waited, its lights burning against the storm. And between past and future, Amos Rigg rode forward, no longer running from what he'd been, not yet sure what he might become, but riding forward nonetheless. Toward home, they rode into the firelight with hands visible and weapons holstered, though Amos's fingers itched toward his gun. 6 of Corrigan's men formed a semicircle around the house, mounted and armed. The sheriff himself sat his bay horse near the porch, looking comfortable despite the rain. Isaiah stood on the porch steps, his rifle cradled in his arms, not pointing at anyone, but ready. Behind him, Sarah held her children close, her face pale but determined. When she saw Amos and Thomas, relief flooded her features. "Mr. Rigg," Corrigan called out pleasantly. "And Deputy Garrett. Out for a midnight ride in the rain? Peculiar weather for a jaunt. Could say the same about you," Amos replied, reining in his horse. "Peculiar hour for a social call." "This isn't social." Corrigan's smile vanished. "This is official. As sheriff, I'm serving notice on these squatters to vacate my property immediately. You had until the end of the week, Rigg, but circumstances have accelerated. What circumstances would those be? Someone broke into the county office tonight, rifled through official documents. Corrigan's eyes glittered in the torchlight. That's a serious crime. Makes me wonder who might be desperate enough to commit it. Thomas's hand moved toward his coat, where the documents lay protected. Amos caught the motion, shook his head slightly. Not yet. Let Corrigan play his hand first. If someone did that, Amos said carefully, they might have found some interesting reading. Dates that don't match up. Signatures that look mighty similar, but not quite right. The kind of discrepancies that make a thoughtful man wonder about things. Corrigan's jaw tightened. Careful, Rigg. You're making accusations you can't prove. Oh, I think proof's coming. Amos looked past the sheriff to Sarah and her children, to Isaiah standing steady despite his age, to the ranch that had somehow survived 3 decades of abandonment and neglect. But before we get to that, I've got a question. My father's death, you reported it as accidental. Why? The question surprised Corrigan, threw him off his prepared script. What? You filed the report with the county? Said his death was accidental. That's what the death certificate says. So I'm asking, did you see him after he was shot? Did you see the body? Corrigan shifted in his saddle, uncomfortable now. I was called to the ranch by one of your neighbors. Found your father dead, your brother dying. You were gone. I did what any responsible citizen would do, contacted the doctor, filed the necessary reports, and then bought the mortgage on the land, Thomas said flatly. Convenient timing. I saw an opportunity, Corrigan said, his voice hardening. Your father was dead, his sons were gone, and the property needed managing. I did what was legal and proper, except for the forgery, Amos said. Except for manufacturing documents and creating a false paper trail. Except for stealing land from a dead man who left specific instructions about what should happen to it. You can't prove any of that. Thomas pulled the wrapped documents from inside his coat, keeping them protected from the rain. Actually, we can. Every forged signature, every false date, every manufactured record. And more importantly this, he held up the letter, sealed in oilcloth now. William Riggs' last instructions, in his own hand, explaining what this ranch was meant to be. Corrigan's face went dark with rage. You stole county documents. That's a felony. I can arrest you right now, both of you, and everything you stole becomes inadmissible. Maybe, Amos said. But before you do that, I'd like to read something. For everyone to hear. He dismounted slowly, took the letter from Thomas, and unwrapped it carefully. The rain had lessened to a drizzle, but he kept the paper protected. Sarah moved closer, the children pressed against her. Isaiah descended the steps to stand beside Amos. Even Corrigan's men leaned in slightly, curious despite themselves. Amos read aloud, his voice steady despite the emotion threatening to crack it. His father's words, written 3 weeks before death, explaining the misunderstanding about the cattle theft. Forgiving both sons for their anger, their violence, their pride, expressing hope that the ranch could become something more than just property, a place where people seeking redemption could find it. It wasn't supposed to be about ownership, Amos said when he finished, looking at Corrigan. It was supposed to be about purpose. My father understood something I didn't, that this land could heal instead of hurt, that it could give instead of take. Touching. Corrigan sneered. But it doesn't change the legal facts. I hold the deed, and these people are trespassing. The deed you forged, Thomas said, which we can prove. Which means every transaction you've made based on that forgery is void. And not just for this property, for all the others you've stolen the same way. That hit home. Corrigan's face went red, and his hand moved to his gun. You've got nothing. Word of a known killer and a disgraced deputy against a sheriff and banker. Who do you think people will believe? I think they'll believe the evidence, said a new voice from the darkness. A rider emerged from the tree line, and Amos recognized him. Cole Preston, the former Texas Ranger who'd settled in the area. Behind him rode 3 other men, all landowners Amos had met in town. We've been comparing notes, Cole said, his voice carrying authority despite his age. Seems a lot of us have similar stories. Properties that somehow ended up in Corrigan's hands when families hit hard times. Foreclosures that came quick and final. Wade here's been building himself an empire, one stolen ranch at a time. This is none of your concern. Preston, Corrigan snarled. It became my concern when you tried to do the same to me last year, Cole replied. Only reason I kept my land is I'm too ornery to die and too suspicious to trust your paperwork. But others weren't so lucky. He looked at the men riding with him. Johnson here lost his place. Martinez lost his. And Campbell's widow is still fighting the case. The balance had shifted. Corrigan's men were looking uncertain now, aware that this wasn't a simple eviction of squatters, but something larger and more complex. One of them, younger than the others, slowly moved his hand away from his gun. You're all making a mistake, Corrigan said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. I am the law here. What I say is legal and binding. Not if the law's corrupt, Thomas said. And not if we can prove it. Corrigan's control snapped. Then you'll have to prove it from a grave. Men, clear these squatters. Use whatever force is necessary. For a moment, everything hung suspended. Guns and decisions, justice and violence, all balanced on a knife's edge. Amos felt time slow, felt the familiar weight of his revolver at his hip, felt 30 years of running collapse into this single moment. He could draw. He'd been fast once, deadly accurate. Could probably drop Corrigan, and maybe one or two others, before they returned fire. But that would make him what Corrigan wanted him to be. A killer. Someone who solved problems with violence. His father's letter, still in his hand, felt heavier than any gun. "No," Amos said clearly, and didn't touch his weapon. Corrigan drew his gun. But before he could aim, Isaiah's rifle cracked. The shot took Corrigan's hat clean off his head. The bullet passing so close it must have singed hair. The old man had never fully raised the rifle, fired it from hip level with casual precision. "Next one ain't missing," Isaiah said calmly. "You want to test an old slave who learned to shoot before you were born, boy? Go ahead and try." Corrigan froze, his gun half raised, murder in his eyes. His men were backing their horses away, unwilling to die for a corrupt sheriff's pride. One of them spoke up, the younger one who'd moved his hand from his gun earlier. "Sheriff, maybe we should—" "Shut up!" Corrigan's voice cracked with fury. He swung his gun toward Amos. "You think you've won? You think your father's letter means anything? I own this county. I own the judge, the clerk, the shot came from Sarah. She'd picked up Isaiah's spare rifle from the porch, and she fired with the same calm precision she'd used to kill the men who'd murdered her husband." The bullet struck Corrigan's gun hand, and his weapon spun away into the darkness. "You don't own us," Sarah said quietly, working the rifle's action. "None of us!" Corrigan cradled his bloody hand, his face contorted with pain and rage. Cole Preston rode forward and dismounted, picking up the fallen gun. "Wait, Corrigan. I'm placing you under citizen's arrest for fraud, theft, and attempted murder. Your men can ride away now, or they can be arrested as accomplices." Their choice. The men chose to ride. Within moments, it was just Corrigan, dismounted and disarmed, facing the people he'd tried to crush. "You can't do this," he said, but the fight had gone out of his voice. "I have rights. You have the right to face justice," Cole said. "Real justice, not the kind you've been dispensing. We'll take you to the territorial marshal. Let him sort through your fraudulent claims. I expect he'll find enough to keep you busy for years." They bound Corrigan's hand and put him on his horse, hands tied to the saddle horn. As Cole prepared to lead him away, Amos stepped forward. "The other families," he said to Cole, "the ones who lost their land, that needs to be made right." "It will be," Cole promised. "I've got enough evidence now with what you've found. We'll see every stolen property returned." After they rode away, the rain-washed silence felt profound. Sarah lowered the rifle, her hands shaking with delayed reaction. Isaiah sat down heavily on the porch steps. Thomas stood holding the documents that had nearly cost them everything, and Amos looked at the letter in his hands, at his father's forgiveness written 3 decades ago, waiting all this time to be found. "He knew," Amos said softly. "My father knew it wasn't our fault, that we were young and stupid and scared, but not murderers. He knew, and he forgave us. The question is," Sarah said gently, "can you forgive yourself?" Amos looked at her, at the people who'd become his unlikely family, at the ranch that had waited 30 years for someone to come home and make it whole. He thought about running, about guilt, about all the years he'd wasted believing he was beyond redemption. "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I'd like to try." Billy and Emma ran to him then, their child's resilience already bouncing back from the terror of the confrontation. They threw their arms around him, and Amos knelt in the mud to hold them, these children who weren't his, but somehow were. "You stayed," Emma said, her face pressed against his shoulder. "You didn't run." "No," Amos agreed, his voice rough with emotion. "I didn't run. For the first time in 30 years, standing in the rain with mud on his knees and children in his arms, Amos Rigg felt something that might, eventually, become peace. The sun rose on a ranch transformed by truth. Amos stood in the barn doorway, watching morning light chase away the last shadows of a long night. They'd spent hours after Corrigan's arrest talking, planning, understanding what came next. The documents Thomas had retrieved were spread across the kitchen table, evidence of systematic fraud that would reshape the county's property records. But justice, Amos had learned, was never as simple as having the truth on your side. Cole Preston returned before noon, his face grim. "The territorial marshal's coming, but it'll be 3 days. And Corrigan's got friends, powerful ones. They know what's at stake. If we can prove his fraud, a lot of rich men lose their ill-gotten gains. They'll come for us," Thomas said. "It wasn't a question. They'll come for the documents first," Cole corrected. "Burn them, claim they never existed. Without physical evidence, it's just your word against a sheriff and banker. Then we protect the documents," Amos said. "And we prepare." The next 2 days were a blur of activity. Cole brought in the families Corrigan had wronged. 12 men and their kin, all with personal stakes in seeing justice done. They turned the ranch into a fortress, not with high walls, but with prepared positions and clear sightlines. Thomas, drawing on his deputy experience, organized watches and established protocols. But it was more than military preparation. It was community building. Sarah and the other women set up a kitchen that could feed 30 people. The children, Emma and Billy and a dozen others, were given tasks that kept them useful and away from danger. Isaiah worked with the younger men, teaching them how to care for the animals that would need tending, regardless of what violence might come. And Amos found himself in the center of it all. This reluctant leader who'd spent 30 years running from responsibility. On the second evening, as the sun painted the valley gold and red, Amos stood at his father's grave, a simple marker he'd found in the small family plot behind the house. His mother was there too, and beside them a stone he hadn't expected, Jacob Rigg, beloved son and brother. "You buried him," Amos said to Isaiah, who'd followed him to the cemetery. "When I left you weren't here, but someone did." "Wasn't me," Isaiah said. "Was already here when I arrived." "Someone cared enough to mark the spot proper." Amos knelt and brushed dirt from the stone. "I never knew. I assumed. I thought maybe he was just left or buried in town or forgotten." "Your father did it," came a voice behind them. They turned to find an old woman approaching, leaning on a cane. She was thin as winter branches, with eyes that had seen most of a century. "I'm Maggie Henderson. Lived in these mountains all my life." "Was here the night your family died?" Amos stood slowly. "You saw what happened?" "I heard the shots. Came running with my husband, God rest him. Found your father and brother both down, bleeding. Your father was still conscious, barely. He told us what happened, that there'd been a terrible misunderstanding, that his boys were good boys who'd let fear turn them against each other." She paused, her voice softening. "He lived long enough to bury your brother himself, insisted on it. Put him here beside your mother, where family belongs." The world tilted slightly. Amos had to steady himself against the gravestone. "He lived? After the shooting he lived?" "Near about 3 days. Long enough to write that letter you found. Long enough to make arrangements. Long enough to forgive." Maggie looked at the graves. "He never blamed you or Jacob, said you were young men who'd lost their way. His only regret was that he couldn't bring you both home to tell you so." The doctor's report said, "accidental death," Amos whispered, "because that's what your father wanted recorded. Didn't want his boys remembered as murderers or his death remembered as patricide. He chose to call it accident, chose to frame it as tragedy instead of crime." The old woman reached out and touched Amos's arm. "He wanted you to come home someday. Wanted you to be able to hold your head up when you did." Amos felt something break inside him, not painfully, but like ice cracking under spring sun. 30 years of guilt, of believing he'd killed his father, of carrying the weight of imagined murder. And all that time, his father had lived long enough to forgive, to understand, to try to build a bridge back to a life his son might one day reclaim. "I wasted so much time," Amos said, his voice rough. "You're here now," Maggie replied simply. "That's what matters." That night, they gathered in the ranch house, all of them. The families who'd been wronged, the allies who'd come to help, the makeshift family that had formed in the crucible of shared struggle. Amos stood before them, his father's letter in his hands, and told the whole truth about the feud and the fear, about the shots and the running, about 30 years of guilt built on a misunderstanding, about a father who'd chosen to die protecting his sons' reputations rather than condemning them. This ranch was supposed to be a sanctuary, Amos said. My father understood something I'm only now learning, that places can heal if we let them. That redemption isn't something we have to earn through perfect behavior. It's something we accept when we stop running from our failures. He looked around the room, at faces marked by hardship and loss, at people who'd all run from something and found themselves here. We're all refugees from our worst days. But maybe that's what makes us family. We understand the cost of being broken, and we understand the courage it takes to try to be whole again. Sarah spoke from near the fireplace. When I came here, I was so tired of fighting, of trying to protect my children alone, of wondering if we'd survive another winter. This place gave us shelter when we had none. Now we're being asked to fight for it. She paused. I'm willing to fight. Not because it's mine by law, but because it's ours by need. Others echoed her sentiment. Johnson, who'd lost his farm to Corrigan's fraud, spoke of justice delayed being justice denied. Martinez talked about his children's right to the land their grandfather had cleared. Campbell's widow stood with quiet dignity and said simply, I'm not running anymore. Thomas checked the documents one more time, ensuring they were secured in a waterproof case. The marshal will want to see these. Without them, Corrigan walks free and all his crimes stand. Then we make sure they're here when he arrives, Cole said. Whatever it takes. Amos walked outside after the meeting, needing air and space to think. He found himself at Clover's paddock, where the ancient donkey stood in moonlight, patient as she'd always been. He stroked her soft nose, marveling again that she'd survived, that she'd waited. You knew I'd come back, he said softly. Somehow you knew. The donkey nuzzled his hand, her breath warm in the cool night. Behind him he heard a footstep and turned to find Emma, unable to sleep, wrapped in a blanket against the chill. Mr. Rigg. Her voice was small. Are bad men coming? He could have lied, could have told her everything would be fine. Instead, he knelt to her level and spoke truth. They might. Men who don't want the truth to be known, who have a lot to lose if we prove they've been stealing. Are you scared? Yes, he admitted. But I'm more scared of running away again, of leaving you and your mother and everyone else here to face trouble alone. Emma considered this with her serious, old-soul eyes. My papa was scared too the night the bad men came, Mama told me. But he stood and fought because he loved us. He died, but he didn't run. Your papa was a brave man. You're brave too, Emma said simply. You came back even though you were scared. That's what Mama says bravery is, doing the right thing even when you're afraid. She hugged him then. This small girl who'd seen too much loss, and Amos held her carefully, aware of how precious and fragile courage could be. Inside the house, he found Sarah still up, cleaning rifles by lamplight. She looked up when he entered, and something passed between them, understanding, respect, something deeper that neither had words for. Thank you, he said, for shooting Corrigan's gun out of his hand, for being willing to fight. Thank you for staying, she replied, for not sending us away when you could have, for choosing to build instead of destroy. They sat together in companionable silence, the kind that comes when words aren't necessary, when shared purpose creates its own language. The next morning, Amos took his father's pocket watch from the box of childhood treasures. It had stopped at the exact moment of his father's death, 11:47, frozen in that terrible instant. For 30 years, it had sat unmoving, a marker of time's end. He wound it carefully, feeling the mechanism resist, then catch. The hands began to move, ticking forward from that long-ago moment, each second a step away from the past and toward whatever future waited. Thomas found him holding it, listening to its steady beat. Symbolic, the younger man observed. Maybe, Amos agreed. Or maybe just practical. A watch that doesn't run isn't much use. Neither is a man stuck in one moment of his life, Thomas said. You're moving forward, Amos, we all are. That afternoon, scouts reported riders approaching, not Corrigan's usual men, but hired guns from outside the county, hard-faced men who made their living with violence. They stopped at the property line, studying the ranch's defenses, counting defenders, assessing the situation. Then they withdrew, but not far. They made camp just beyond rifle range, a clear message that they were waiting, that violence would come when they were ready. The families with children began preparing to evacuate them to safer ground. Sarah wanted Billy and Emma gone, safe with Maggie Henderson in the mountains, but the children protested. "We belong here," Emma said stubbornly. "This is our home, and we'll make sure it stays your home," Amos told her gently. "But that means keeping you safe enough to come back to it." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. As the children were loaded into wagons for the trip to the mountains, Emma ran back to Amos and pressed something into his hands. It was the wooden horse his father had carved, the one she'd been learning from. "Keep it safe," she said. "Like you're keeping us safe. Promise you'll give it back when this is over." "I promise," Amos said, and meant it with everything in him. As the wagons rolled away, carrying the future to safety, the defenders settled into their positions. They weren't professional soldiers, just ordinary people who'd had enough of being pushed, enough of running, enough of letting corrupt men decide their fates. And in the center of it all, Amos Riggs stood beside his father's grave, the watch ticking in his pocket. Time moving forward at last. The sun set on the third day. In the morning, the territorial marshal would arrive. But the hired guns camped beyond the property line wouldn't wait that long. They'd come tonight, in darkness, trying to burn the documents and scatter the defenders before the law could intervene. Everyone knew it. Everyone prepared for it. And in the hours before dawn, as shadows gathered and tension built, Amos found peace in a strange place, in the knowledge that whatever came, he wouldn't face it alone, and he wouldn't run from it. Some battles he'd learned were worth fighting. Some places were worth defending. And some families were worth dying for, even if they weren't the family you were born into. He touched the wooden horse in his pocket, feeling its smooth surface, remembering his father's patient hands crafting something beautiful from raw wood. Transformation was possible. Redemption was real. And second chances, however late they came, were still chances worth taking. The watch in his other pocket ticked steadily onward, marking time that was no longer frozen, no longer fixed to a moment of tragedy. Time was moving. Life was moving. And Amos Rigg, after 30 years of standing still, was moving with it. They came in the darkest hours before dawn, when exhaustion made guards careless and shadows provided cover. Amos was awake, had been all night, standing watch from the barn loft, with a clear view of the approaches. He saw them moving, darker shapes against darkness, spreading out to encircle the ranch, professional. These weren't Corrigan's usual deputies. These were men who killed for money, who knew how to move silently and strike hard. He gave the signal, a single sharp whistle that brought the defenders to full alert. Within seconds, every position was manned, every rifle ready. The hired guns realized they'd lost surprise and changed tactics, rushing forward in a coordinated assault. The first shots shattered the pre-dawn silence. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like lightning. Amos fired methodically, years of experience steadying his hands, and saw one attacker go down. Beside him, Cole Preston's rifle cracked in steady rhythm, but the attackers kept coming, driven by whatever Corrigan had paid them or promised them. They reached the barn, the house, firing through windows and trying to force doors. Sarah shot from an upstairs window, her face grim and determined. Isaiah held the barn's side entrance, his old rifle speaking with calm authority. Then everything changed. More riders appeared on the road. Not hired guns, but Corrigan himself, accompanied by a dozen men and someone else. In the growing light, Amos recognized the territorial judge, a man named Whitmore who'd been in Corrigan's pocket for years. They rode right up to the ranch house, bold as brass, while the gunfight raged around them. "Cease fire!" Corrigan bellowed. "I am here in my official capacity as sheriff with Judge Whitmore. Any further violence will be prosecuted as insurrection against lawful authority." It was audacious, using the cover of hired guns while claiming legal authority. But it worked. The defenders held their fire, uncertain. The attackers fell back but stayed close, weapons ready. Amos climbed down from the loft and walked into the yard, rifle lowered but not put aside. Thomas and Cole flanked him. Sarah emerged from the house and Isaiah from the barn. They stood together, facing Corrigan and his corrupt judge. "You got some nerve," Amos said, his voice carrying across the yard. "Attacking us with hired guns while hiding behind a judge." "I'm executing a lawful eviction," Corrigan said. His gun hand was bandaged, but his other hand rested on his holstered weapon. "Judge Whitmore has reviewed my claim and found it valid. These people are squatters, and you're interfering with the law. We have documents that prove otherwise," Thomas said, stepping forward with the waterproof case. "Evidence of your systematic fraud, forged signatures, false foreclosures, stolen documents," Judge Whitmore said pompously. "Obtained through illegal breaking and entering. Inadmissible in any court, even when they prove you're both thieves," Cole challenged. Corrigan smiled coldly, "Especially then. You see, Rig, this was all inevitable. You should have taken my offer when you had the chance. Now you'll watch as I clear your property of vermin, burn those fraudulent papers you stole, and establish once and for all who really owns this county," he gestured. And his men moved forward, some toward Thomas and the documents, others spreading out to surround the defenders. The hired guns emerged from cover, forming a cordon. They were outnumbered now, outmaneuvered. Amos felt the old familiar calculation. Angles of fire, who to shoot first, how many seconds before it all collapsed into bloody chaos. His hand moved to his gun, then he stopped. His father's voice from across decades, "Violence begets violence. Killing solves nothing, but creates new problems." Instead, Amos turned and walked toward the barn. "I want to show you something, Corrigan. Something that'll matter more than bullets." Corrigan laughed. "What could possibly—" "The truth," Amos said simply. "In a form even you can't deny." In the barn, he found the old brand iron, the one his father had used to mark their cattle, a simple R inside a circle. He thrust it into the forge fire Isaiah kept burning, waited until the iron glowed red. Then he took a board, one of the barn planks worn smooth by time and use, and placed it flat. He pulled out his father's letter, protected in oilcloth, and began to burn the key passage into the wood, letter by letter, word by word. "What are you doing?" Thomas asked, following him. "Making evidence that can't be stolen or burned or declared inadmissible," Amos said, concentrating on the careful work. "This barn is part of the original homestead. This wood is older than Corrigan's lies. And these words—" He pressed the brand into the wood, burning his father's forgiveness and his vision for the ranch into permanent form. "These words will outlast all of us." The smell of burning wood filled the barn. Amos worked quickly but carefully, creating a record that was literally carved into the bones of the property itself. When he finished, the passage stood clear and readable, burned deep into the wood. "Let this ranch be held not as property, but as sanctuary for those who seek redemption." He turned to find Corrigan had followed him into the barn, his face twisted with fury. "Clever but pointless. I don't care what your father wanted. I don't care about your redemption or your refugees. This land is mine, and I'll do what I want with it. Then you'll have to kill me first," Amos said quietly. Corrigan's hand moved to his gun, his good hand, and he drew. "That," he said, his voice thick with satisfaction, "can be arranged. You're a known killer, Rig. Everyone knows what you did to your family. One more death won't matter." The barn door darkened as others crowded in. Thomas, Sarah, Isaiah, Cole, and behind them Corrigan's men and the judge. Everyone watching as past and present collided in this space where Amos had once kept his childhood treasures, where Clover had waited 3 decades, where the brand iron still glowed red in the forge. "Go ahead," Amos said, looking down the barrel of Corrigan's gun. "Pull the trigger. Add my death to your list of crimes. But know this, you're not taking this place. Not from them, not from anyone who needs it. My father died protecting that vision, and I'll do the same." Corrigan's finger tightened on the trigger, and time seemed to slow, the moment stretching out like the space between heartbeats, between past and future, between violence and grace. The moment stretched taut as a bowstring. Corrigan's gun aimed steady at Amos's chest, his finger white on the trigger. Around them, the barn had gone silent, everyone frozen, waiting to see if history would repeat itself, if violence would beget more violence in this place already soaked in blood. You want to know the truth, Rig? Corrigan's voice was thick with venom. About your precious family feud? I started it. Spread the rumors about cattle theft. Made sure each brother suspected the other. Your father never mortgaged this land. I forged those documents while you were all too busy tearing each other apart to notice. The confession hit Amos like a physical blow. 30 years of guilt, of believing he and Jacob had destroyed their family through pride and anger, and it had all been orchestrated, manipulated by a man who wanted their land and was willing to destroy them to get it. Rage rose in Amos, hot and familiar. His hand moved toward his own gun, years of instinct taking over. He could draw, could fire, could end this corrupt man who'd ruined so many lives. It would be justice. It would be right. But then he thought of Emma's small hands learning to carve wood, of Billy struggling with arithmetic, of Sarah's determination to build something from ashes, of Isaiah's wisdom about animals remembering kindness, of his father's letter choosing forgiveness over condemnation, and he stopped. His hand moved away from his gun, rose slowly, palms open. No, Amos said clearly. I'm not giving you what you want. I'm not becoming a killer again. Not for you, not for revenge, not for anything. Corrigan's smile was cruel. Then you're a fool. And a dead one. He pulled the trigger. The hammer fell on an empty chamber. In the chaos of the bandaging and the night's events, he'd forgotten to reload after the earlier confrontation. The click of metal on metal was the loudest sound in the barn. Amos moved fast, faster than a man of 69 should have been able to move. He closed the distance between them in 3 strides, knocked the gun from Corrigan's hand, and drove his fist into the corrupt sheriff's face. Corrigan went down hard, his nose breaking with an audible crack. "Get him up," Cole Preston ordered, and 2 of the ranchers hauled Corrigan to his feet. His face was bloody, his eyes wild with fury and fear. "Search him," Thomas said. "Everything. We need evidence that'll stick." They went through Corrigan's pockets, his coat, his saddlebags. Judge Whitmore tried to protest, but Cole's rifle in his direction convinced him silence was the better option. In Corrigan's saddlebag, wrapped in oilcloth like something precious, they found a length of rope. It was old, well-worn, and along its length were tied 13 knots, each one careful and deliberate. "What is this?" Thomas asked, holding it up. Johnson stepped forward, his face going pale. That's from my property. I tied that rope myself, used it to mark the boundary between my land and the creek. When Corrigan foreclosed, it disappeared. I thought..." He touched one of the knots. Each section between knots was 100 yards. "I measured it myself." Martinez moved closer, examining another section. "This piece has my mark. See the red thread I wove through it. I used it for my horses. It went missing the week before I lost my farm. One by one, the other ranchers identified portions of the rope, pieces taken from their properties. Corrigan had kept them tied together, a tally of his conquests. 13 knots for 13 families destroyed. "It's a trophy," Cole said grimly. He kept count of every family he ruined. The judge tried one last protest. "This proves nothing. It's just a rope. It's evidence of systematic theft," Thomas cut him off. "Combined with the forged documents, the testimonies, and this man's own confession, which we all heard, it's enough to hang him legally. Or would you prefer we do it the other way?" The threat hung in the air. Judge Whitmore deflated, understanding his complicity was now exposed. Corrigan's hired guns, seeing their employer defeated and disarmed, began backing away. They'd been paid to fight, not to die for a lost cause. "Anyone who fires another shot will answer to me," came a new voice from the barn door. The territorial marshal had arrived early, drawn by reports of gunfire. Behind him were federal deputies, armed and official. "Wade Corrigan, you're under arrest for fraud, theft, conspiracy, and attempted murder. Judge Whitmore, you're coming too." As they led Corrigan away, he spat blood and cursed, promising revenge that everyone knew would never come. The corrupt judge went quietly, already calculating his defense. The sun was rising now, painting the valley in gold. The defenders began to lower their weapons, relief and exhaustion washing over them in equal measure. Thomas sank to the ground, and only then did they see the blood spreading across his side. He'd been hit during the initial assault, had fought through it on determination alone. Sarah was beside him instantly, tearing cloth for bandages. "You damn fool, why didn't you say something?" "Didn't seem like the time," Thomas managed, his face pale but smiling. "Besides, I've had worse. Isaiah helped carry him to the house, his wounds serious but not fatal. The ranch had taken damage, bullet holes in the barn, broken windows, torn up earth where men had fought and fallen. But it stood. They all stood. Amos walked outside, his father's letter still clutched in his hand, and looked at what they'd defended. Not just property, not just buildings, but the idea his father had died trying to protect, that broken people deserved a place to heal, that redemption was possible. That sanctuary mattered. The wooden plank with the burned-in passage lay propped against the barn wall. His father's words made permanent, carved into the very bones of the place. Clover emerged from the barn, somehow untouched by the violence, and pushed her soft nose into Amos's hand. He stroked her neck, this impossible creature who'd survived against all odds, who'd waited 3 decades for someone to come home. "We did it," Sarah said, coming to stand beside him, her hands still stained with Thomas's blood. "We saved it. We did more than that," Amos replied, watching the sun climb higher. "We made it what it was supposed to be all along." 3 weeks after the guns fell silent, the ranch was alive with the sound of hammers and saws. The territorial marshal's investigation had confirmed everything: Corrigan's systematic fraud, the forged documents, the 13 families he'd destroyed. The rope, with its 13 knots, became the centerpiece of evidence that would send him to prison for the rest of his natural life. Judge Whitmore faced his own reckoning, stripped of his position and awaiting trial. The court's ruling on the Rig Ranch came swift and clear. The property had never been legally foreclosed because there had never been a legitimate mortgage. William Rigg's will and his letter to the county established the land as held in trust, exactly as he'd intended. The judge assigned to sort through the mess, a stern woman named Helena Cartwright, brought in from the territorial capital, read the letter aloud in court and declared it binding. "This land is to be maintained as a sanctuary," she'd ruled, "for those seeking redemption and second chances. Amos Rigg, as surviving heir and trustee, will administer it according to his father's vision, with county oversight to ensure that purpose is maintained. It wasn't complete ownership, but it was something better. It was purpose. It was legacy. It was exactly what his father had wanted." Now Amos stood with Isaiah in the ranch yard, holding a newly carved sign between them. They'd worked on it together over long evenings, Amos's hands remembering his father's patient teaching, Isaiah's steady guidance helping shape the letters. The wood was good Montana pine, the carving deep and clear. "Rigg's Rest," it read. "A home for second chances." They mounted it on new posts at the property's entrance, replacing the old weathered sign that had fallen to rot decades ago. Sarah and her children watched, along with Thomas, recovered now, though he'd carry a scar, and Cole Preston, who'd become a regular presence, helping coordinate the legal restoration of properties to the families Corrigan had wronged. "It's beautiful," Sarah said softly, standing beside Amos as they looked at the finished sign. "Your father would be proud." "I hope so," Amos replied. "Took me 30 years to understand what he was trying to tell us, about family, about responsibility, about what really matters." The ranch had become what William Rigg had envisioned. Sarah and her children were the first official residents, but they weren't alone. A widow named Martha had arrived the week before, fleeing an abusive son-in-law, bringing her grandson. An orphaned boy of 15 came next, referred by a church in Helena that had heard about the place. A veteran of the Indian Wars, missing an arm and most of his mind, found his way there, guided by some instinct that broken places could shelter broken people. Thomas had become the ranch's foreman, his experience and organizational skills perfect for managing the growing community. Isaiah taught anyone who would listen about caring for animals, about patience and steadiness, about how creatures and people remembered kindness. Sarah managed the house and the garden, teaching women and children skills they'd need to build their own lives when they were ready to move on. And Amos found himself in a role he'd never expected: patriarch, teacher, guardian of his father's vision. He kept the letter framed on the wall of the main house, where everyone could read it, a reminder of forgiveness and possibility. On a cool October morning, Amos walked to the family plot and stood before the 3 graves. His mother, his father, his brother, all the family he'd been born into, all gone now. But for the first time in 30 years, standing there didn't feel like drowning in guilt. It felt like remembering people he'd loved, accepting tragedy without letting it define everything that came after. "I came home, Pa," he said quietly. "Took me longer than it should have, but I'm here. And I'm doing what you asked, making this place matter, making it mean something." The wind rustled through the pines, and Amos chose to hear understanding in it. That afternoon, he found Clover lying in her favorite sunny spot by the barn, her breathing shallow and slow. He knew immediately. The impossible donkey, who'd survived 3 decades against all odds, was finally letting go. He sat with her, stroking her grey muzzle, talking softly about the boy he'd been when she was young, about the man he'd become, about the journey that had brought him home. She died peacefully, her head in his lap, as the autumn sun painted everything gold. They buried her near the barn where she'd waited so long. With the marker Isaiah carved, "Clover, she waited," Emma cried, and Amos held her, both of them mourning the gentle creature who'd been the bridge between past and present. The living proof that some connections endure beyond all reason, but life continued as it does. New people arrived, stayed a season or a year or longer. Some healed and moved on. Others found permanent home in the community that grew around Riggs Rest. The ranch thrived not despite its violent past, but because someone had chosen to transform it into something that mattered. On a spring morning, Amos sat on the porch with Billy, now 11 and growing tall, teaching him to carve. The boy's hands were careful on the knife, his tongue pressed between his teeth in concentration, exactly as Amos remembered doing himself under his father's patient instruction. "Why is it important?" Billy asked, pausing in his work. "Learning to carve, I mean. We got plenty of things already made." "Because," Amos said, thinking of his father's hands and his own, of Emma's growing skill and the wooden horse that connected 3 generations, "we're all connected to what came before. Your grandfather's hands taught your mother. My father's hands taught me. My hands are teaching you. It's how we pass things forward. Skills, yes, but also patience, care, the understanding that making something beautiful takes time. And mistakes," Billy added, ruefully examining a spot where his knife had slipped. "Especially mistakes," Amos agreed, smiling. "That's where the real learning happens. The ranch spread around them, alive with purpose. In the paddock, new horses grazed. In the garden, Martha taught her grandson about growing things. Thomas worked with the veteran, giving him one-handed tasks that built his confidence. Isaiah sat in the barn doorway, mending tack and humming old songs from before the war. Sarah emerged from the house carrying a basket of vegetables, saw Amos and her son together, and smiled, the first truly unguarded, joyful smile Amos had seen from her. Something passed between them, an acknowledgement of more than gratitude, something that might become something else if they let it. Amos looked out at the valley, at the land his father had built and he'd abandoned and they'd all reclaimed together. He thought about running, about the 30 years he'd spent trying to outpace guilt and grief, about how he'd finally learned that some places hold you even when you let them go, and that sometimes the past offers one last shot at grace. He was home, truly home. Not because he owned the land, but because he'd learned what it meant to serve it, to honor it, to let it be what it was meant to be. A sanctuary for broken people learning to be whole. The watch in his pocket ticked steadily onward, marking time that was no longer frozen, no longer bound to tragedy. And in his other pocket, He felt the weight of the wooden horse Emma had returned to him, a symbol of connection and continuity, of lessons passed from hand to hand and heart to heart. Some stories end in violence, some in loss. But this one, Amos thought, watching his chosen family move through their day, ends in possibility, in second chances, in the understanding that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about choosing what we build with the broken pieces, and what they'd built, all of them together, was something worth more than property or ownership. They'd built home. They'd built family. They'd built grace from guilt and life from loss, and that, Amos understood at last, was the only victory that truly mattered.